Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to Chronicles the Curious for inviting me. It's fun. I haven't done many of these workshops, but every time I do, I think I learn something myself and really enjoy it, so I'm excited. To start, I think I forgot to ask for the ability to screen share, but it looks like I have it. I'm just gonna share a little slideshow to tell you guys a little bit about how I use illustration in my work as an ornithologist, and just some of the stuff I've done since I started illustrating birds professionally. Oh, it's been almost 5 years ago now. But okay, to start, I wanted to show you guys a little bit of the work I've done that's more, you know, I'm an ornithological illustrator, and that means that I illustrate birds in a way that communicates something about those birds in a scientific way. And my illustrations are all supposed to be pretty true to form about what particular species look like and why. But I have done some more artistic things, even though they feature real birds in ways that they, and how they actually look in the wild. Here are some things I've done that are more artistic. I've had the opportunity to design logos for organizations or for events. But most of my work has been, you know, like I said, in ornithological illustration. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with bird art in field guides. I have the pleasure of working on a revision to this field guide to the birds of Costa Rica, where I'm illustrating all of the raptors that can be found in Costa Rica. And here are some of the plates from that project. And you can see that the purpose of illustrating for a field guide is to communicate aspects about the particular species to aid in its identification in the field. So it's a particular style and a particular format, and something that I really enjoy doing. But I've also illustrated birds for publications, scientific publications that I've published, most of which are from my time and work in the field in Alaska. And here are just a few of these figures from these publications. The illustrations in some ways are just meant to add an artful component to a figure, but they also help communicate more clearly what that figure is about. For instance, in the bar chart on the left, for one who's familiar with these two species, you can easily look at that and immediately tell that each bar chart corresponds to the fork-tailed storm petrel on the top and for dark shearwaters on the bottom. The same goes for the red-legged kittiwake in the bottom right, but I've also used illustration to communicate plumage aspects to help support why I identified the first record of a breeding record of a certain subspecies of barn swallow in Western Alaska that's shown in the upper right. I've also had the pleasure of publishing some work with the Peregrine Fund that has, in the figure on the right, I created this figure as it's a cladogram that shows all the species of raptors and how they're related. And the purpose of the paper was to propose a new definition or a defensible definition for what a raptor or a bird of prey is. And then I also was involved in publishing a paper that showed the taxonomic disagreements in raptors and why that's important for conservation. And so I created this figure on the left for that paper. Now, I'm currently a PhD student at the at Cornell University and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So a lot of my life is behind the computer and doing analyses and research, or being in the field. So illustration has become something that that's taking up less of my time. But the nice thing about being with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is there's plenty of people at the lab, including my advisor, who really value illustration and its use in ornithology. So I am very much encouraged to do that. My dissertation work is going to focus on the bird that you can see there that I'm holding there, the red-tailed hawk. And I'm going to get to illustrate plumage diversity in the red-tailed hawk, which there's quite a bit. So I'm excited about that. Another project I'm working on right now is a project that's an investigation into the genomic basis of plumage polymorphism in the Eastern Screech-Owl. And for those of you that aren't familiar with any of the words that I just said or what's on the screen there, basically it's I'll just give you some background about the Eastern Screech-Owl real quick. The Eastern Screech-Owl is this forest owl that breeds in Eastern North America. And it comes in basically two color types, a red morph and a gray morph. And our investigation is to look into the genetics behind what creates the differences in the plumage. And this is important because it will help us understand a little bit about the evolution of the species and this trait in particular, so that we can better understand why those two plumage types occur in the population. And so tonight, I thought the workshop would focus on illustrations that I'm currently working on to better communicate this project. And you can see here in this figure, I've already have illustrated one of the gray morphs, but tonight I am going to illustrate the red morph. And I'd like to just break down this figure so you understand why I think that I'd like to include a red and a gray morph in this particular figure that I've shown you here. On the horizontal axis of this chart is the location on the genome of these owls. And so any dot is a location or genetic material at a certain point on the genome. And on the vertical axis is a measure of how different the genetic material at that location is between the two different morphs. So where you have a dot that's higher vertical, that's a position on the genome where there's a lot of differences in the material there between the red and the gray morph. And given that we control for other things and choosing our samples, we can be pretty confident that those regions are responsible for the different plumage types between the two morphs. So I want to show that this really clearly that this figure is a comparison of the genetic material between red and gray morphs. So I want to include a red and a gray morph owl as I've shown here, but I've already done the gray owl. So tonight I'm going to start with you guys the red owl. And as I go along, I'll explain a little bit about my process and some of the considerations that I am keeping in mind as I create the illustration for making sure that I show the differences in the plumage between the two in a correct and clear way. So I'm going to stop screen sharing right now. And I'm going to switch over to the camera that's on the canvas. And I'm going to switch audio too. So bear with me. This might be a little bit clunky, but I'm going to try and do it as clean as possible. Okay. One more thing. Okay, how does that look?
Looks great.
Okay. Okay.
Bryce, do you want us to throw in any questions that come up while you're working, or hold them off?
Sure. So I'm just gonna start illustrating, and I'm gonna try and explain what I'm doing as I go along. But if anybody has questions or thoughts as we go along, I think you should feel free to ask him and interrupt me. That's totally fine. Before I start illustrating though, I wanted to explain a little bit about how I get to this point, because this, from putting paint down onward, is only about half of the workload. A huge part of the time it takes me to create these illustrations is in the sketching phase. So I want to show you the sketches that I do before I do anything. You can ignore this one. This one's one that I haven't finished yet. But before I start painting, I spend a lot of time sketching, and I spend a lot of time using these erasers too, to make sure that the bird is in the position that I really like, that I think will communicate all the things that I want about the bird, and that I'm pleased with what I have before I start putting any paint down. Because once you start putting paint down, if you mess up or you don't like it, you have to start all the way over. So when I get something that I really like, I then use this transfer paper and I trace it. And then after I trace it, I flip it over and retrace on this side to get some pencil on this side. So then I can then take it to the canvas, put it down on the canvas and position it, position the birds or the bird in the correct spot, so that I know that everything's where I want it before I ever start putting paint down. And I've already done that with the red owl. You can kind of see it there.
Bryce.
And sometimes before I start painting, I will darken some lines, if they're lines that I want to make sure still, if they're lines that I want to be dark. Pencil, once water gets on pencil, it darkens quite a bit. So sometimes I just darken some outlines to make sure that I have everything in places that I know I want.
Bryce, what do you use for reference material, given how important scientific accuracy is for these?
Definitely. So it's very nice for me, being a field ornithologist. I've gathered a lot of reference material for myself over the years, but that's only for particular species. I actually don't have any of my own reference material for the Eastern Screech-Owl because I haven't lived in the East until about 8 months ago. So I don't have a lot of experience with this species. So what I use is the Macaulay Library, which is this amazing multimedia resource that houses, I don't even know how many millions of photos and audio of birds. And I go to Macaulay Library and I look through tons of photos of whatever bird I'm illustrating. And I use that to build my bird during the sketch phase into what I want. Now in the when I start painting, I use those as if I were out watching the bird. There's so many photos that you can basically look through the Macaulay Library and you can see a bird that you're illustrating in almost any posture that you would see it in the wild. So right now on my computer screen, I've got pulled up 5 images of red Eastern Screech-Owls that I'm going to use tonight as reference material. But if that's only because I don't want, because this is a workshop and you guys are watching me, I don't want to have too much lag time as I search for another image. If it were just me illustrating, I would be spending a lot of time looking through images in Macaulay before, searching for a particular posture, showing the plumage at a particular angle, or looking for a particular, plumage characteristic. Because you just have to make a bunch of little decisions as you put together a bird, because there's so much variation between individuals and birds, that you have to decide, where's the middle ground between what do most birds look like that are of this species, and then what does this particular plumage character look like in any given posture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Bryce, a couple questions for you. One from the Werners. Some curious lads, curious folks over there want to know, how do you decide on the best pose for the bird?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. It really is about what I want to communicate with the illustration. And I really like the style that you see in a lot of guidebooks. That is this profile posture that these owls are in, where it shows a bird directly from the side. And the reason I like this for most of my illustrations is because it captures the most of the important areas of the plumage. So you can show a bunch of different characteristics in a single illustration, if that makes sense. But if I was illustrating something that was more focused on trying to communicate something about a flight posture, or a plumage character that you can only see in flight, or a behavior, then I would think about that and how to illustrate what's the best posture to illustrate to communicate the task at hand. I hope that makes sense. So right now, all I'm doing is I'm taking a neutral color and I'm just tracing over most of the pencil marks in my illustration with a neutral color. And I do this before I put any real color down, because I'm going to use this skeleton of neutral color as a way to start getting form out of the bird.
Bryce, can I throw one question at you? From Liz, who asks, when you're painting plates of multiple birds, do you always paint them on one page, or do you sometimes combine them digitally? Coming from, I work mostly digital now, and I find like when you're doing two illustrations right on top of each other on the same page, it's kind of scary to me.
It's yeah, that's a really good question, and it's totally scary in some ways, because part of the cool thing about, to answer Liz's question, part of the neat thing about creating these images is that they all get digitally, they all get transferred to a digital file where you can cut them up and put them in any position you want, or combine them with another illustration or something like that. But I try, like, say if I were to illustrate a plate, an identification plate of the Eastern Screech-Owl, I would try to illustrate the plate with as much information and as many birds as I would want, or that I need to convey for that plate that would be the digital plate. Because what you then have is this unique style of a painting that shows these birds in a plate. And I don't know. That's this. I think that's a very. I really love that style, and I think a lot of birders enjoy that style in the original painting itself. Yeah, so I strive for that. But I will say that on the Costa Rica guidebook, there have been times where I've passed the paintings back to the authors for revisions, and they've had some substantial edits, so much that I have had to repaint one of the birds on the plate. So there will be species or plates in that book that are compositions of more than one painting. Hope that answers your question.
Bryce, Terry is curious, as I'm sure some others are too. Are you using paints or using diluted ink? What materials are you using?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So you'll see that I'm using what is called gouache, and that is a type of watercolor that has a lot of pigment in it. It's kind of a heavier pigmented color than traditional watercolors are. And I actually use it mostly like a watercolor, but it's pretty powerful. And a lot of illustrators, particularly bird illustrators, really like it because you can layer paint on top of each other. And so as you see me right now, what I'm doing is I am starting out with light color and I'm building to dark. And that's the strategy in watercolors. In something like an acrylic, you start out with dark colors or acrylic or oils. You start out with dark and you build in, you build out the light colors. So it's like the opposite strategy. But with gouache, because you can layer stuff over top, you can build light to dark, and then you can use white to highlight stuff. And it gives us this really neat look to it. So I really like gouache. I don't know, sometimes I wonder if I really am using it to its fullest potential. Because I kind of like taught myself how to use it, but it's a fun medium. It's also a little different from other watercolors because you can reactivate the pigment. So like if, for instance, if I, on this one, if I don't like some of this black, if I think it's too dark, I could take some water and just rough it up a little bit, even though it's all dry. I can just take some water and scrape it off a little bit and make it a little lighter. Or if some detail isn't exactly right, I can, blend it out and retry. Okay. So this is just a really slow and careful process. And that's kind of what you get in illustration, or the way I like to take it is really slow, because the more particular you are, the better your product is at the end. I've found a lot of, in sketching and everything, being really particular and not moving forward until you think things are right is worth it. But I think I'm a really slow painter.
Given your need to focus, we'll throw another question at you. I'm particularly impressed that you can have a conversation and maintain a really sharp focus. There was an earlier question about color matching and whether you use study skins for that ever.
Yeah, I love museum work, that's one of the reasons why I'm pursuing a PhD. And I will say that these owls that this study I'm doing on these owls, all of the data, the genomic data I have from them is from museum samples or study skins. And I took color readings from every single bird that I have a sample from. And have, had a chance to really look at this bird in particular in the museum. And so to answer that question, I have, and I have in other things that I've illustrated. I had plans to go to some museums for the Costa Rica stuff and really study the plumage of some of the species that I was illustrating that I wasn't that familiar with. There are some species that I have to illustrate, like some of the forest falcons that I've never seen in the wild, like slated-back forest falcon. And so going to the museum not only helps me like get a better understanding of the correct color, but also if the plumage details that I'm seeing, like say in a photo, are match what I would see on a bird in real life, or what actually makes that plumage detail look the way it does. So yeah, museum specimens are very useful, helpful. I just haven't really spent any time in a museum lately because of COVID, which is, too bad, but I will. The Cornell has a great museum that I'm going to be spending a lot of time in when able.
Bryce, I had one question. Do you do sketching like out in the field? Like, and if so, how do you do birds? And is there any like technique or equipment that would help with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't done a lot of field sketching, mostly because, I'm not exactly sure. I'm not very good at it, but I did start doing something that is essentially the same exercise as I do with the Macaulay photos when I'm having to illustrate something, say, a field guide plate where I know the posture that I want, and I have, tons of photos of birds to use as reference material, but none of them are in this, exact posture. So I have to build that posture out of, reference photos. But you can actually do that if you have a very confiding bird in the field. And I took an expedition to this really remote island in the middle of the Bering Sea a few years ago. And late in the summer, this particular bird called the McKay's bunting had a bunch of fledglings that went to the coast because there was a certain fly that would like hatched and was flying all around all the vegetative material that washes up with the tide. And so the adults were also there too, helping, they were feeding the young. And so I had birds. I would just sit down on the beach, and there were birds all around me, foraging, and they were really confiding, and they would get close to me. And so what I did was I just sat there and sketched them, and I kind of just chose how I wanted the posture of my sketch to be. And then once I decided that, I just watched the birds, and every glimpse I got where the bird was, that part of the bird was in the right posture, I would just kind of try and record it. And I erased a lot. I drew a lot of lines, kind of just molding it like clay to build a bird. And I think that exercise, that's a really fun and good way of approaching field illustration. Okay, so I'm gonna, now that I've got some of the shape of the bird down, I'm gonna start throwing some color down. But color is this really intimidating thing, and I feel like I haven't quite figured it out, because you can do a lot with color. But in birds, it's really important that the color's right, because that's what makes the bird look like the bird, just as much, as anything. So you can't really see it, but what I use is I have these are my paints, and I just, mix stuff in the middle, and I try and get the proper color. And before I put any color down, I test it on this little sheet, and I don't put any color down until I feel like this color is the right color for the bird. And in watercolor and in gouache, again, it's the best to start really light and go dark. So you do this thing called wash. You use washes. And so to start, you just put down a wash of color. And what that means is it's a light wash of the color of the bird. And that's the start of getting color put down on the bird. Now, for my figure, for the research I'm doing, I'm going to want to make this be on the extreme of the redbirds. There's basically a continuum of plumage coloration from these really gray birds all the way to these really red birds. And I want to show the polar opposites on that continuum, even though a lot of birds are, red-brown or gray with some reddish tones in it. So I picked photos that were really reddish birds. So I'm going to paint that type.
This is so cool to see this coming together. We have a couple, I guess, equipment questions or questions about the types of paint you use and the types of paper you use. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, yep. It's a good question, because I have found that the materials you use make all the difference. You can be really talented and you can be doing everything correctly. If you choose the right materials, it's just going to increase your success in creating these, nice images even more. So it is important to have the right materials. I feel like I will forever be on a search for good brushes. I found some that I like, but I think I'm constantly switching brushes and just trying stuff out. I haven't found one that I really, have to use forever. But the general rule of thumb is if you spend money, you're probably getting a better product. Again, there's good and better in that as well, but you do need to spend a little bit more money. The same goes for paper. I spend a lot on paper because it makes a difference. This paper that I use is very nice. I can put down a lot of water. I can abuse the paper quite a bit, and I don't get any beating or anything like that. It absorbs things really nicely. And I'll quickly show you what I use. So I use arches, and for illustrating birds, I use the hot pressed. It's block paper, so it's 20 pages that are just on top of each other, sealed together. So it's a really firm surface to paint on, and it's really fine. I don't use coarse stuff. You know, there's certain watercolor paper that you can get that is rough, and that's just, you know, particular style. But for putting down really fine details, you want this really fine surface without any texture, so that you can make sure that you're able to get these fine details and they show up as you intend. So I just need to mix a little bit more color here, so bear with me.
Kind of related to that detail note, there's a question about the scale or the size that you normally try to work at, or do you have sort of a standard size that you work at?
Yeah, one of my friends, who's the collections manager at the Museum of Southwestern Biology in Albuquerque. He's an illustrator, and he does really nice stuff. And he told me something that's stuck with me. He told me this a few years ago, but he said, you should really never, you know, if you're a scientific illustrator, you should stay away from illustrating a bird larger than it is in real life. And, you know, I bet people would argue against that. And there are definitely arguments against that. But I think his point is that once you start illustrating it larger than it actually is, it's harder to keep proportions and everything like that in check. You have to be really, it's just more difficult. So it's easier for you if you illustrate the bird either true to size or smaller than it is in real life. And for my field guide illustrations, I illustrate pretty small stuff, but I chose, in discussions with the publisher and the authors, we just decided on a canvas size, and I've stuck to that. And I can actually, I'm working on, I have it right here. So this is I don't know if this shows up really well, the size, but this is the set size for all those Costa Rica illustrations. And, you know, this bird, generally my birds are around this size. And that just makes it manageable for me to, you know, I can do it somewhat quicker than like a full paged painting, but it's not so small that I have a hard time getting in the fine details. So I think there's a happy medium there. And I think that this, you know, when this is done, I can give it to a friend and they can frame it up and it doesn't take up their whole wall in their living room, you know? Yeah. It's difficult when you try and illustrate something too small. So one thing I'm going to do right now before I do anything else is I'm going to color the eye, because when you have something with a light eye, you want to make sure you get that light coloration there, because you're going to leave that alone for the rest of the painting. When you have this darks and stuff, if you try and color the eye after you put that paint down, you have a chance of the paint bleeding into that and ruining that light eye. So again, with that idea that you should build your bird if you're using watercolors or gouache, build your bird from light to dark, putting the light stuff down first. And with these screech owls, it's kind of a judgment call for how intensely to color the iris. It's a yellow iris, but in particular lighting, it can be a little orange. And in other lighting, it can be a little dull. So that's just a judgment call. I try and stay away from overly saturating colors because that doesn't necessarily look natural. But if you make it too light, you also, have something that looks incorrect or whatnot. And then it's important, I'm not going to do this tonight, but this illustration is not completely done. And oftentimes I don't finish one of them completely before I go on to the next one, because I might see something as I'm doing this that I'd like to change in this. And I kind of learn as I go from bird to bird. And I often hop back and refine this as I go along. So it's not this like set process for me where I go finish one bird, go to the next. It's more organic than that, where I feel my way to completion, where I'm constantly revising stuff as I go along.
Bryce, is there ever a need to, this one comes from Joanne, AKA my mom, is curious if you ever paint birds in their environments.
Yeah, I have. I'm not very good at it. I haven't really liked what I've done. But I think that's because I don't have a lot of experience with it, painting habitats. That's something that I want to put time into down the road. But I've done it a few times for, like, I've done a number of journal covers for the Journal of Raptor Research, and their preference is to have those be birds in habitat. So that has pushed me to try. And some I feel a little embarrassed about. Others I just purposefully made them very simple, basic backgrounds. But yeah, it's a good question. I'm very bird obsessed, and it's all about, habitat's important and everything, but I'm a birder, so I love going out and identifying birds. So I'm very focused on just the bird, and I love painting the fine details of the plumage and trying to capture it in the right way and everything. But there's definitely going to come a time when I start trying to be a little more artful and paint birds as you'd see, in their habitat and stuff.
That's a good segue into Melissa's question, which is, what has been the most difficult bird you've ever created, and what has been your favorite? P.S. Thank you for the covers for Journal of Raptor Research.
Yeah, my most difficult bird. There are too many that I just complain about because I can never get them right. And I'm blanking on, there's definitely some that I just can never get right. I like doing owls, but I really like doing owls with dark irises. But these ones with the light iris, I will tell you, this thing, the last few nights as I've been painting it, I've just been fairly frustrated because I feel like something's off. And I feel that way with most of my paintings. Like there's something that I could have done better. But yeah, I think owls with light irises, for whatever reason, I feel like I can never really get right. Yeah, I'll think of others as we go along. But what was the second part to that question?
Favorite bird to paint.
To paint. Yeah, the what's your favorite bird question is one that birders get a lot, and you know, people have answers, but I never really do. I kind of like really fall in love with what occupies my attention at the moment, in birding and also in painting. But yeah, I really enjoy raptors, obviously painting them because they're an incredible challenge. And I think bird illustrators across the board will probably echo that same sentiment. For whatever reason, I think they just have these proportions that are hard to properly to capture. So yeah, I think I don't really have a favorite that I enjoy painting. But I will say there's one group that I haven't painted a lot of, but I really want to paint because I love them and I love their aesthetic, and that is Procellariidae, members of the family Procellariidae. So that's like your shearwaters and your petrels, and they're just, I don't know. I think when I see other illustrators that do them correctly, I'm so envious of that skill. There's one illustrator, John Gale, who just finished illustrating for a book. He's from Britain, and the illustrations that he's done of all the seabirds and that are just incredible. And I really want to try painting like that, what he's done. So I'm getting to the point where I'm going to have to start really paying attention to my reference material, and being even more calculated. But this is also a point where you'll see me use color to help get the form of the bird. And you can use color just like you use grayscale or even shades of blue to darken the bird and build the form of the bird, the shape. And this is the wrist that I'm doing right now. And it's a little bit dark here because there's some relief as it bends into the bird right there. And I'm purposefully leaving this white and this white because, as you can see on this bird, some of the feathers there they're white, and it causes this really neat little pattern. So I'm not going to touch those quite yet.
Bryce, a couple questions coming in about sort of your path here and how you got interested in illustrating birds, and were you always painting and drawing growing up, or did this kind of evolve as you were studying?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's actually kind of a funny story. I started noticing birds when I was a kid, and I was actually living about a mile from where I'm at right now, here in Ithaca. I grew up here for part of my childhood because my dad did his PhD at Cornell as well. Um, and when I was about 8 years old, I just started noticing birds, and for whatever reason, felt compelled to figure out what to call what I was looking at. I remember watching great blue herons at a pond and becoming obsessive about stalking them and trying to get close and watching them do what they do. Also, I'd come home, look at them in the bird book, and I would draw them. So I started drawing birds when I was a kid, and it's kind of continued as I grew up, but didn't really get all that serious until I was finishing college and I started hanging around. I did my undergrad at University of Utah and started hanging around an organization called Hawkwatch International there and doing field work. And at the same time, started drawing raptors and sharing them with folks there, and they all really encouraged it. So after that, I picked it up more as a hobby, got a little more serious about it and then did it while I was doing my master's in Boise at Boise State, and just sharing it with folks and everything. Just kind of organically turned into something that people encouraged more and more, to the point that, after I graduated with my master's in 2016, my wife, Caitlin, then started her master's at Boise State, so kept us there, and I decided to make a go at being a professional illustrator, and so that's kind of how it happened. And I will say that part of the reason I'm back here in Ithaca at Cornell, I mean, a huge part of it is because of my illustration, I think. My advisor was with me on that trip to St. Matthew Island in the Bering Sea when I was sitting on the beach, drawing the birds that were foraging around me. We got along really well, and I think he really values illustration. So yeah.
But there's a lot of comments just thanking you, saying this was really fun to see your process, and it is very cool. So we're grateful.
I'd have to say it's amazing to see just how steady the evolution is. I think for work that I do, it's sort of like things kind of appear and disappear, like in sort of uneven rates, and this just seems like such a steady pace. It's amazing.
Yeah, I take it slow because I don't want to overdo something or do something incorrectly. There's a lot of important decisions to make. Yeah, I've never tried digital illustration, but I think I want to, because that ability to erase and take a step back would only help make sure that you get a really nice end result.
So, yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. You know, is that, do you see that in your future? And all I can say from my point of view of like being completely digital now, when you're showing your stacks of paper and the gouache, and I mean, I miss all that. So
Yeah,
I hope you don't go completely in the other direction.
yeah. I don't think I ever would go completely in the other direction, because although I'm still staring at a computer screen for my reference material, one of the reasons I like painting is that I'm not like, slumped over my computer like I am 99% of my other time working. It's a nice break. And it does feel like really, I don't know, organic and connected. But I do want to try digital illustration, because I've seen some bird illustrators that have done some that have been really nice. Thanks for the invitation. It's been fun.